little village. It's the northeast of Kharkiv, and it's really been at the sharp end of the war for the past 2 years. It was occupied by the Russians in for about 2 months immediately following the invasion. It was then basically leveled to the ground by constant shelling for the next few months. And just when they thought they'd got some respite this year, there was another offensive in May, and the shelling has resumed. But despite that, they've remained incredibly resolute and determined to rebuild their village. And at the heart of their plans is this public square for Boris.
You might have heard of Bill Clinton Boulevard in Kosovo and a generation of young men there called Tony Blair. Well, a small town in eastern Ukraine is soon to have a Boris Johnson Square. Locals in Tsyrkuny have faced the brunt of Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and after being liberated from Russian occupation, they want to show their gratitude to the now pretty divisive in this country former PM, but fairly universally lionised figure over there. He was the first Western leader to visit the country following the invasion. The Times' reporter Tom Ball paid a visit to Tsyrkuny, and he joins us now live from Kharkiv. Tom, morning to you.
Good morning.
Tell us about this place then, what they're saying, why they've gone for Boris Johnson.
Well, it's a pretty out of the way little village. It's the northeast of Kharkiv, and it's really been at the sharp end of the war for the past 2 years. It was occupied by the Russians in for about 2 months immediately following the invasion. It was then basically leveled to the ground by constant shelling for the next few months. And just when they thought they'd got some respite this year, there was another offensive in May, and the shelling has resumed. But despite that, they've remained incredibly resolute and determined to rebuild their village. And at the heart of their plans is this public square for Boris.
And what do they say when you ask them about Boris Johnson?
Their eyes light up. It's bizarre. It's not. It's the kind of thing that perhaps you used to see in 2019 in this country, but it was. People really are incredibly grateful to him for coming over here in April of 2022, when the situation was still incredibly volatile and uncertain, and the Russian army was, only a few miles from Kiev at that point, and added to that, Britain was very early out of the traps in providing Ukraine with anti-tank and anti-aircraft equipment. So, to quote the deputy mayor of Tsyrkuny, he gave them hope in their darkest hour.
Is there something about his personality as well? Because there are some people who criticise, I imagine the people even in Ukraine who criticise the fact that Britain and the West generally hasn't given enough, was too slow. We were quicker than many other countries, Britain, but still haven't done enough necessarily. But is there something about Boris Johnson that he can be a little mascot type figure in people's minds because he has a certain look, a certain persona? Do you think that's been part of the reason why they're attracted to him?
Essentially, yeah. I mean, I think the Boosterism wore thin pretty quickly in Britain, but I think here it still has a certain appeal, and I think there are some of those that I spoke to in Tsyrkuny certainly in some ways associated to him with Churchill as well, and
Yeah.
I think that's the impression that he obviously wants to give, and the people here have accepted that.
Do they mention other British politicians? Did they talk about what Rishi Sunak did when he was Prime Minister? Did they talk about Keir Starmer's stance on Ukraine, which of course is still very supportive? Did they have a sense of British politics beyond Johnson?
Yeah, I did ask them. Will there be a Rishi Sunak street and a Starmer street as well afterwards? But no, it was Johnson all the way. Uh, I think it's symbolic more than anything else because, as you say, Sunak and Starmer have continued to provide the same level of support. But I think it really was just that image of Johnson walking around the streets of Kiev, surrounded by flak jacketed, heavily armed men with Zelensky, and being shown, the points of the city that had been hit by Russian artillery, and that was really quite affecting for most people here. Yeah, I mean, he continued to visit as well. I think he visited last year, and he's perhaps visited one more time. And each time he does, they're always incredibly welcoming to him.
Yeah. I actually do remember him doing that. I mean, it was a memorable moment because it was in that moment of uncertainty in the war still. It was fresh enough that it was seen as a step, him taking that. Just generally speaking, Tom, news about the war ebbs and flows in this country. I suspect the general narrative now here is that things haven't gone well for Ukraine. Russia has ramped up. It's looking very hard for there to be an outright victory for Ukraine. There's going to have to be some settlement. There's the looming problems of a Trump presidency, potentially. There's a feeling, at least, that this is only going in one way. What's the mood on the ground when you're actually there?
I think there is a subtle shift going on here. I think whereas a year ago you'd be very hard pressed to find anyone that was calling for any form of negotiation. Now I think it's not. I think it's easier to talk about the subject without immediately having the conversation shut down. And there was a poll a month or two ago which found that something like half the population were now open at least to the idea of negotiation. And it's been a grinding war. It's 2.5 years in. The front line has largely stayed static for the last year or so, and yet every day there are thousands of people dying on the front lines, and it's a highly attritional, highly lethal war. And here, somewhere like Kharkiv, just a few hours ago, there was a missile that hit the center of the town, just a few miles away from where we are, and lots of civilians have been injured, and that kind of thing, is incredibly damaging to the morale of the local populace, as the Russians intend it to be.
Yeah, it's remorseless still, isn't it? Well, listen, keep safe, Tom, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you.
That's Tom Ball there. He's in Kharkiv, and he's been visiting a place which now is about to have Boris Johnson Square.